The dust swirled across the main street of Redemption Creek as Ethan Blackwood tied his stallion to the hitching post outside the Red Mountain Saloon. His weathered face, lined with 47 years of hard living on the frontier, betrayed nothing of the storm raging within him. 3 years had passed since he'd last set foot in this town. 3 years since Catherine Montgomery had testified against him in a trial that cost him everything: his ranch, his reputation, and nearly his life. Now, with a pardon from the governor proving his innocence in the stagecoach robbery, Ethan had returned to reclaim what was rightfully his. His hand unconsciously brushed against the worn leather of his holster as he pushed through the saloon's swinging doors. The piano music faltered, conversations died, and all eyes turned to the tall figure whose silhouette was backlit by the harsh midday sun. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from today? Sheriff James Wilson was the first to speak, rising slowly from a corner table. "Didn't expect to see you back in these parts, Blackwood." His hand hovered near his Colt Peacemaker as he approached, boots echoing on the wooden floor. The saloon's patrons shifted uneasily, memories of the bloody shootout that had occurred during Ethan's arrest still fresh in their minds. Ethan's eyes swept the room until they locked with those of Catherine Montgomery, who stood frozen behind the bar, her knuckles white as she gripped the polished wood for support. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, her once fine dress replaced by the practical attire of a working woman. In the years since he'd been gone, she had apparently taken ownership of the establishment, the very saloon once owned by her late husband, Thomas Montgomery, the man whose accusation had sent Ethan to prison. "I've got business in town, Sheriff," Ethan replied, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the hatred he felt for the woman watching him with widened eyes. "And I plan to stay until it's finished." He produced a folded document from his vest pocket and laid it on the table, the governor's pardon that cleared his name. Wilson scanned it with narrowed eyes as whispers spread through the saloon. Catherine's face had drained of color, and Ethan took a grim satisfaction in her obvious distress. The circumstances that had brought him back to Redemption Creek were complicated and known to very few, including the fact that the Montgomery Ranch, which bordered his former property, now legally belonged to him as restitution for his wrongful imprisonment. The sheriff handed the document back with a reluctant nod. "Pardon or not, I'll be watching you, Blackwood. This town's been peaceful since you left." The warning was clear, but Ethan merely inclined his head slightly before turning his attention back to Catherine. The years in Yuma Territorial Prison had hardened him beyond recognition. Gone was the respected rancher who'd once courted Catherine before she chose the wealthy Thomas Montgomery instead. In his place stood a man consumed by thoughts of retribution against the woman who had supported her husband's false accusations. "Mrs. Montgomery," he said, tipping his hat with mock civility, "I believe we have matters to discuss regarding your property." Catherine's composure returned gradually, though her voice still trembled slightly when she spoke. "Mr. Peterson can show you to a table if you'd like a drink, Mr. Blackwood. I have customers to attend to." She turned away, but not before Ethan caught the flash of fear in her eyes, fear that told him she already knew why he had returned. Ethan settled at a corner table, ordering whiskey from the nervous young bartender while maintaining a clear view of Catherine as she moved about the saloon. The truth that few in town knew was that Thomas Montgomery had died 6 months ago, leaving substantial debts that Catherine had been struggling to pay, and the deed to their ranch was now in jeopardy. Outside, Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising the first storm of the season. Inside, the piano player had resumed a tentative melody, though the atmosphere remained tense. Ethan nursed his whiskey, watching as Catherine served drinks and exchanged pleasantries with customers who deliberately avoided looking in his direction. His plan was simple: force Catherine to marry him, to save her from financial ruin, use her connection to influential people in the territory to restore his standing, and then discard her once his reputation was rebuilt. It wasn't the justice he'd initially sought when planning his return, but it would suffice. A life of misery with a man she had helped condemn seemed fitting punishment for her betrayal. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan observed Catherine's interactions with the townspeople, noting how many treated her with genuine respect. This surprised him. The Catherine he remembered had been a pampered socialite who looked down on the working class of Redemption Creek. Something had changed in her during his absence. There was a newfound dignity in her bearing, a kindness in her interactions that seemed authentic rather than calculated. When the saloon emptied temporarily between the afternoon and evening crowds, she finally approached his table, chin held high despite the tremble in her hands. "I understand you've acquired the deed to our ranch, Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly. "Though I'm curious how a recently released prisoner managed such a purchase." Ethan gestured to the chair across from him, and Catherine reluctantly sat down. "The governor was quite generous with his compensation once my innocence was proven," he replied, watching her face closely. "Your late husband's debts made the purchase particularly affordable." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I know about your financial situation, Catherine. The bank will foreclose on this saloon by the end of the month unless you find a substantial sum of money." Her eyes widened slightly, confirming his information was accurate. "I'm prepared to offer you a solution that would benefit us both," he continued, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "A marriage of convenience. You would keep your businesses and property, and I would regain my standing in the community." Catherine's laugh was harsh and unexpected. "You must truly despise me to propose such an arrangement," she said, her green eyes meeting his without flinching. "To be forced to marry the man I helped send to prison? I assume that's your idea of justice?" Ethan didn't deny it, and something in his expression made her shake her head slowly. "You don't know everything that happened while you were gone, Ethan. Thomas wasn't the man you or I thought he was." A customer entered the saloon, and Catherine rose quickly. "I need time to consider your proposal," she said, straightening her apron. "Meet me at the ranch tomorrow morning. We'll discuss terms then." She walked away without waiting for his response, leaving Ethan to wonder what secrets about Thomas Montgomery she might reveal. The storm broke as Ethan rode to his rented room at the boarding house, rain soaking through his duster and dripping from the brim of his hat. Lightning illuminated the silhouette of the hills where his ranch, his former home, stood abandoned after its seizure. Tomorrow, he would ride out to the Montgomery Ranch and force Catherine's hand with the threat of complete financial ruin. If she refused his offer, he would ensure the bank foreclosed on both her saloon and her home, leaving her with nothing. It was a cruel plan born from 3 years of nurturing his hatred in a prison cell. Yet as he stabled his horse and shook the water from his coat, an unbidden memory surfaced. Catherine, as she had been when they first met, laughing by the creek that ran through his property, her face alight with a joy he had once hoped would be directed at him forever. The next morning, dawned clear after the storm. The air fresh with the scent of rain-soaked earth as Ethan rode the familiar trail to the Montgomery Ranch. He'd expected to find the property in disrepair, given Catherine's financial difficulties, but was surprised to see well-maintained fences, healthy cattle grazing in the pastures, and a freshly painted main house. As he approached, he noticed a group of children playing in the yard under the watchful eye of an elderly woman. This was unexpected. Catherine and Thomas had never had children. He dismounted at the hitching post, drawing curious stares from the children, who fell silent at the sight of the stranger. Catherine emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Blackwood," she greeted him formally. "Please, come inside. Mrs. Abernathy, would you take the children to collect eggs?" The interior of the house was modest but well kept, with simple furnishings that were a far cry from the ostentatious decor Thomas Montgomery had once boasted about in town. Catherine gestured for Ethan to sit at the kitchen table while she poured coffee into 2 cups. "I'm sure you have questions about the children," she said, sitting across from him. "After you were sent to prison, Thomas's gambling debts mounted. He began drinking heavily, and his business decisions grew increasingly reckless." She paused, her fingers tightening around her cup. "When the orphanage in Silver Ridge burned down last year, leaving 12 children homeless, I convinced Thomas to let them stay here temporarily. It was the last good thing he did before his heart gave out 6 months later." Ethan's brow furrowed as he processed this information. "You're running an orphanage?" The question came out harsher than he intended, tinged with disbelief. Catherine met his gaze steadily. "Not officially, but yes. The bank has been lenient with the mortgage payments because of the children, but their patience is running out." She took a deep breath. "Before we discuss your proposal, there's something you need to know. Thomas confessed on his deathbed that he was the one who robbed the stagecoach. He framed you because he believed you were still in love with me, and he wanted you gone." Ethan's hand froze midway to his coffee cup, shock rendering him momentarily speechless. "I've spent the last 6 months trying to find a way to make things right," Catherine continued, her voice breaking slightly. "When I heard about your pardon, I hoped you might return, though I never expected forgiveness." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. While he had always known he was innocent, hearing that Thomas had deliberately framed him and that Catherine had been unaware of her husband's guilt forced him to reassess everything he had planned. "Why should I believe you?" he asked finally, searching her face for signs of deception. In response, Catherine rose and retrieved a letter from a drawer, placing it before him. "Thomas wrote this confession before he died. I sent a copy to the governor, which I believe contributed to your pardon." Ethan scanned the letter, recognizing Thomas Montgomery's handwriting and signature. The confession was detailed and unambiguous, describing how he had orchestrated the robbery and planted evidence to implicate Ethan out of jealousy and financial desperation. "I spent 3 years in prison because of your husband," Ethan said slowly, struggling to contain the turmoil of emotions the letter had unleashed. 3 years planning how I would make you both suffer when I got out." Catherine nodded, her expression solemn. "I understand your hatred, Ethan. If you still want revenge, I won't fight you. But I ask that you allow me to find homes for the children before you take everything." The sincerity in her voice gave Ethan pause. This wasn't the entitled woman he remembered. The hardships of the past 3 years had clearly changed her, as much as prison had changed him. Outside, The laughter of children floated through the open window as they returned with baskets of eggs, their faces bright with an innocence that seemed out of place in the midst of such a bitter confrontation. Conflicted, Ethan rose from the table and moved to the window, watching the children as they helped the elderly Mrs. Abernathy with their chores. "How do you manage to feed and clothe them all?" he asked, his back to Catherine. He heard her sigh behind him. "The saloon provides some income, and I've been selling preserves and baked goods to the mercantile. The older children help with the cattle, and we grow most of our own vegetables. It's not easy, but we've managed so far." There was pride in her voice, the kind that comes from honest work and sacrifice, something Ethan understood all too well from his own years of building a ranch from nothing. He turned to face her, seeing her in a new light, despite his determination to hold on to his anger. "I still intend to hold you to our arrangement," he said finally, his voice gruff. "But my terms have changed. I'll clear your debts and put the ranch in both our names. In return, you'll marry me as planned, but I'll help with the children and the running of both properties." Catherine's expression was guarded, suspicious of this sudden change of heart. "And what do you gain from this arrangement, beyond the satisfaction of forcing me to marry a man who hates me?" The question was blunt, and Ethan appreciated her directness. "A chance to rebuild what was taken from me," he answered honestly. "My ranch is in ruins, and starting over alone would take years. Together, we could make something worthwhile, for the children, if nothing else." Catherine considered his words carefully before responding. "I accept your terms, Mr. Blackwood, though I have one condition of my own, that we try to build this partnership on truth, not vengeance." She extended her hand across the table, her gaze steady. "I can't change what happened, but I can promise to work alongside you honestly from this day forward." Ethan hesitated before taking her hand, calloused from years of hard work, so different from the soft fingers he remembered. "Agreed," he said simply, sealing a bargain that fell far short of the revenge he had planned, but which offered something he hadn't considered: a path forward that didn't require him to become as cruel as those who had wronged him. The wedding took place 3 days later, a small practical affair at the town clerk's office, with only Sheriff Wilson and Mrs. Abernathy as witnesses. The townspeople watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as Ethan moved his belongings into the Montgomery Ranch, now the Blackwood Ranch once again. The arrangement was strictly business at first. Catherine continued to manage the saloon, while Ethan began the work of combining their cattle herds and repairing the fences between the properties. They slept in separate bedrooms, their interactions formal and limited to discussions about the ranch, the saloon, or the children's needs. Yet as days turned to weeks, the rigid boundaries between them began to soften, almost imperceptibly. It was the children who bridged the gap, particularly 8-year-old Samuel, who followed Ethan everywhere, eager to learn about horses and cattle. "Mr. Blackwood," the boy asked one evening as they repaired a saddle on the porch, "were you really in prison?" Catherine, who was shelling peas nearby with some of the girls, tensed at the innocent question. Ethan paused in his work, considering how to respond. "I was," he said finally. "For something I didn't do." Samuel nodded solemnly. "Miss Catherine, I mean Mrs. Blackwood, she told us sometimes good people have bad things happen to them, but that doesn't make them bad people." The simple wisdom in the child's words struck Ethan deeply, especially when Samuel added, She said that about you even before you came back." That night, unable to sleep, Ethan found himself drawn to the kitchen, where a light still burned. He found Catherine at the table, mending clothes by lamplight, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. She looked up at his approach, setting aside her needle and thread. "The children have taken to you quickly," she observed, pouring him a cup of coffee without being asked. Ethan sat across from her, noting the dark circles under her eyes. "They're good kids," he replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "Samuel mentioned you spoke of me before I returned." Catherine's cheeks flushed slightly as she nodded. "I thought they should know the truth, that an innocent man had been wronged and that we had played a part in it, however unwittingly." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the house settling. "Why did you never have children of your own?" Ethan asked eventually, the question arising from genuine curiosity rather than the desire to wound that had driven so many of their earlier interactions. Catherine's hands stilled in her lap. "Thomas didn't want them," she said simply. "He said they would interfere with his business ambitions." It was one of many disappointments in our marriage. The admission contained no self-pity, just a statement of fact that hinted at years of quiet suffering. "And you?" she asked, looking up at him. "Did you ever think of having a family during those years before everything happened?" The question transported Ethan back to a time when his future had seemed full of promise, when he had imagined a wife and children sharing the home he had built with such care. "Yes," he acknowledged, surprised by his own candor, though life had other plans. Catherine nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Life often does," she agreed softly, as their conversation continued, touching on memories of Redemption Creek before Thomas Montgomery's influence had changed things. Ethan found himself reluctantly admitting that this woman was not the villain he had constructed in his prison cell. She had been as much a victim of Thomas's manipulations as he had been, though in a different way. When they finally bid each other goodnight, something had shifted between them. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but the first tentative steps toward understanding. The following weeks brought gradual changes to life at the ranch. Ethan and Samuel constructed a proper schoolroom in one of the outbuildings, and Catherine convinced the town schoolteacher to visit 3 times a week. The orphans thrived under the stable routine and clear boundaries Ethan established, while Catherine's natural warmth provided the nurturing they craved. Together, they created something neither had anticipated: a functioning family. Still, Ethan maintained an emotional distance from Catherine herself, unwilling to completely surrender the anger that had sustained him for so long. That changed on a stormy night in late October, when a rider arrived with news that shattered the fragile peace they had established. Thomas Montgomery's younger brother, Victor, had returned from California and was contesting the sale of the ranch, claiming that Thomas's confession had been coerced and that Ethan had no rightful claim to the property. Moreover, he had petitioned the court to have the orphans removed and placed in proper institutions, arguing that the Blackwood Ranch was an unsuitable environment for children. The rider, a clerk from the lawyer's office in the county seat, delivered the court summons and departed quickly, leaving Catherine and Ethan staring at the document in stunned silence. "Victor was always jealous of Thomas," Catherine said finally, her voice barely audible above the rain pounding on the roof. "And he always wanted this land. But to go after the children?" Ethan watched as Catherine's composure crumbled, tears spilling down her cheeks as the full implications of Victor's actions became clear. Without thinking, he moved to her side, his hand tentatively touching her shoulder. "We won't let him take them," he promised, the words emerging with a fierce certainty that surprised him. "Or the ranch." Catherine looked up at him, vulnerability and gratitude mingling in her expression. "Why would you fight for them?" she asked. "This arrangement between us was never about the children." Ethan found himself unable to articulate the profound shift that had occurred within him over the past weeks. How the orphan's unconditional acceptance had begun to heal wounds he hadn't realized were still open, or how watching Catherine's genuine care for them had forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about her. Instead of answering directly, Ethan shared what he had been most reluctant to admit. "When I was in prison," he began haltingly, "what kept me going wasn't just thoughts of revenge. It was remembering this land, the way the light hits the eastern pasture at dawn, the sound of the creek after a rain." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "This place is worth fighting for, and so are the children who've made it a home again." The confession seemed to reach Catherine on a level their previous interactions hadn't, and she impulsively covered his hand with her own. "Then we'll fight," she said, determination replacing despair in her eyes. "Together." The touch of her hand sent an unexpected warmth through Ethan, a sensation he quickly suppressed. This was about survival, he reminded himself. Nothing more. The legal battle that followed tested them both. Victor Montgomery proved to be a formidable opponent, backed by wealthy associates from San Francisco, who saw opportunity in the expanding territory. He offered evidence, suggesting that Thomas's confession had been written under duress, and character witnesses who questioned Ethan's fitness as a guardian due to his prison record. Catherine sold her mother's jewelry to pay for a lawyer, while Ethan worked double shifts at both the ranch and the saloon to maintain their income. The strain took its toll. Catherine grew thin and pale, while Ethan's old shoulder injury from a prison fight flared up from overwork. Yet in their adversity, the walls between them continued to crumble as they relied on each other in ways neither had anticipated. One evening, after the children were asleep, Ethan found Catherine in the barn, weeping silently as she leaned against a stall. The court hearing was scheduled for the following day, and their lawyer had warned them to prepare for the worst. Without hesitation, Ethan gathered her into his arms, offering the comfort of his strength. "I never thought I'd say this," Catherine whispered against his chest. "But I'm grateful you came back to Redemption Creek, Ethan. Even if we lose tomorrow, these months have been—" She trailed off, unable to find words for the unexpected happiness she had found in their unconventional union. Ethan's arms tightened around her as he acknowledged a truth he could no longer deny. The woman he held bore no resemblance to the enemy he had constructed in his mind during those dark years in prison. That night, as a prairie thunderstorm raged outside, Ethan and Catherine faced the prospect that it might be their last night together in the home they had come to share. The tension that had simmered between them since his return to Redemption Creek finally culminated in a kiss that began hesitantly but quickly deepened with the release of years of suppressed emotions. In the sanctuary of Catherine's bedroom, a room Ethan had never entered before, they came together not as adversaries or even as business partners, but as a man and woman who had traversed a landscape of hatred and emerged against all odds on the other side. Afterward, as Catherine slept in his arms, Ethan gazed at the ceiling, marveling at the irony. he had entered this marriage intending it as punishment, only to find himself falling in love with the very woman he had sworn to make suffer. The courtroom was packed the next morning as Judge Howard Sinclair presided over the case. Victor Montgomery sat confidently with his lawyers, occasionally sending smug glances toward Catherine and Ethan. The proceedings began with Victor's attorney presenting arguments against the validity of Thomas's confession, followed by testimonials questioning Ethan's character. When it was their turn, Ethan and Catherine's lawyer called several witnesses from town who attested to the positive changes at the ranch and the well-being of the orphans under their care. The most powerful testimony, however, came from Catherine herself, who spoke with quiet dignity about her late husband's confession and the new life she and Ethan had built for the children. As she described how Samuel had overcome his fear of horses under Ethan's patient guidance, or how little Mary had finally begun to speak again after months of silence, many in the courtroom were visibly moved. When Ethan took the stand, he found himself speaking from the heart rather than from the carefully prepared statements their lawyer had coached him on. "I returned to Redemption Creek seeking vengeance," he admitted, looking directly at Judge Sinclair. "I wanted to punish those who had wronged me, including Catherine Montgomery." Murmurs spread through the courtroom at this candid confession. "Instead, I found a woman who had created a home for children who had nowhere else to go, a woman who had the courage to admit her husband's wrongs and try to make amends." His voice grew stronger as he continued, "Your Honor, I've worked cattle drives and built a ranch from nothing. I've survived 3 years in Yuma prison, but nothing has taught me more about strength and decency than watching Catherine with these children." Judge Sinclair's face remained impassive as he considered the evidence presented by both sides. After what seemed an eternity, he cleared his throat and delivered his ruling. While Thomas Montgomery's confession showed signs of being written by a man in poor health, there was no evidence of coercion. Furthermore, the legal transfer of the property to Ethan Blackwood as compensation for his wrongful imprisonment was valid and binding. Most importantly, the court found that the orphans were thriving in their current environment and would not be removed. Victor Montgomery stormed out of the courtroom as the judge adjourned the proceedings, his threats of appeal fading as he disappeared through the doors. Catherine and Ethan remained seated, momentarily overwhelmed by the realization that their home and family were secure. As they left the courthouse, the children, who had been waiting anxiously with Mrs. Abernathy, rushed to meet them. Samuel was the first to reach Ethan, his young face alight with concern. "Are we going to stay together, Mr. Blackwood?" he asked, his small hand clutching Ethan's sleeve. Ethan knelt to the boy's level, placing his hands on the child's shoulders. "Yes, son. This is your home now, all of you." Relief washed over Samuel's face, followed quickly by a shy smile. Can I call you Pa then, like a real family?" The question caught Ethan off guard, stirring emotions he had long suppressed. He glanced up at Catherine, who stood watching them with tears in her eyes. And in that moment, the last vestiges of his bitterness dissolved completely. That evening, as the children celebrated with a special dinner Mrs. Abernathy had prepared, Ethan found himself observing Catherine across the table, seeing her truly for the first time, not as the woman he had believed betrayed him, nor as the reluctant partner in a marriage of convenience, but as someone who had endured her own trials and emerged with her compassion intact. When the meal was finished and the children were settling into their rooms for the night, Ethan asked Catherine to join him on the porch. The autumn air was crisp, the sky ablaze with stars that seemed to stretch forever across the vast frontier. "I never thanked you," he said quietly, "for sending Thomas's confession to the governor, for trying to right the wrong that was done to me, even before I returned." Catherine shook her head slightly. "I should have questioned Thomas's accusations from the beginning," she replied. "I knew the kind of man you were, Ethan. I should have trusted that." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Ethan turned to face her fully. "When I proposed this marriage, I saw it as a way to punish you," he confessed. "I never imagined," he trailed off, struggling to articulate the transformation that had occurred. Catherine's eyes searched his face, hope and uncertainty mingling in her gaze. "Never imagined what?" she prompted softly, her breath visible in the cool night air. Ethan reached for her hands, holding them gently between his own. "I never imagined I could forgive," he said simply, "or that I could find something worth more than revenge." The words were inadequate to express the profound shift in his heart, but Catherine seemed to understand nonetheless. She stepped closer, her fingers tightening around his. "And have you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Found something worth more?" In response, Ethan drew her into his arms, his kiss answering the question more eloquently than words ever could. As they stood together under the vast canopy of stars, Ethan Blackwood, once bent on vengeance, found himself on his knees in a gesture that surprised them both. Overcome by gratitude for the unexpected gift of a second chance at happiness with the woman he had been forced to marry, but had grown to love beyond measure. The following spring brought new life to the Blackwood Ranch. The merger of their herds had proven profitable, and with Victor Montgomery's threat removed, they were able to focus on expanding their operations. Catherine continued to manage the saloon in town, though she had hired a reliable manager to handle day-to-day operations so she could spend more time at the ranch with the children. Ethan had begun the process of legally adopting all 12 orphans, a step that transformed their makeshift family into a permanent one. Samuel, now 9, had taken to ranching with natural aptitude, while the other children had found their own niches in the bustling household. The wounds of the past had not disappeared entirely. There were still nights when Ethan woke in a cold sweat, his mind back in the confines of his prison cell, but Catherine's presence beside him served as an anchor to the present. On a warm afternoon in late May, as Ethan and Samuel repaired a fence in the eastern pasture, Catherine rode out to meet them with news from town. The territorial governor would be visiting Redemption Creek the following week and had specifically requested to meet with Ethan and Catherine. "He wants to see firsthand the outcome of his pardon decision," Catherine explained as they rode back toward the house together, "and to meet the children he's heard so much about." Samuel rode ahead on his pony, proudly carrying the tools they had been using. Ethan watched the boy with unmistakable pride before turning to Catherine with a smile that still had the power to quicken her pulse. "I reckon we've given him a good story to tell," he said, reaching across to squeeze her hand. As they crested the hill that overlooked their property, they paused to take in the view. The sprawling ranch house with smoke curling from its chimney. The barn and corrals where healthy cattle and horses grazed. The schoolhouse they had built with their own hands. And the garden where the younger children were helping Mrs. Abernathy harvest early vegetables. It was a scene Ethan could never have imagined during those dark days in prison, when vengeance had been his only companion. "You know," Catherine said thoughtfully, "when you first proposed this marriage, I thought it was a punishment I deserved. Payment for the part I played in your imprisonment." She turned to meet his gaze directly. "I never expected to find happiness in it." Ethan's hand moved to the small of her back, drawing her closer on her horse. "Nor did I," he admitted. "Seems we were both wrong about a great many things." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, bathing the landscape in a golden light that softened every edge and contour. In the distance, they could hear the children's laughter floating on the breeze, a sound that had become the heartbeat of their home. "I'm grateful for that wrongness," Catherine murmured, leaning into his touch. Ethan nodded, the simple gesture conveying all that remained unspoken between them. That sometimes the journey from hatred to love is as vast and unpredictable as the frontier itself, and all the more precious for having been traversed. As they rode the final stretch toward home, Ethan reflected on the curious path that had led him back to Redemption Creek seeking vengeance, only to find redemption instead. The woman beside him, once the focal point of his bitterness, had become the center of a life richer than any he could have imagined. Their story, like the territory itself, had been shaped by hardship and conflict, but had ultimately yielded to something enduring and true. And as the setting sun cast long shadows across the land they had fought so hard to preserve, Ethan Blackwood, once bent on making Catherine Montgomery suffer, found himself offering silent thanks for the unexpected twist of fate that had forced him to see beyond his hatred to the possibility of love that had been waiting there all along. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.